Hey everybody, welcome to another cup of coffee. So most of the time we don't really pay too much attention to the back of the card. But every now and then, something interesting pops up that catches your attention. And that was definitely the case when I took a look at the back of Sandalio Consuegra's 1953 Bowman color card. The first sentence really caught my attention. It says, "Sandy is one of the many Cubans who can usually be found around Griffith Stadium." I thought that was a pretty unusual way to start his description, and it got me looking into his background as well as the Washington Senators' connection to Cuban baseball. In the 1940s and 50s, Joe Cambria and his boss, Clark Griffith of the Washington Senators, were largely responsible for bringing Cuban players into the majors. In fact, back in 1911, outfielders Rafael Almeida and Armando Marsans were largely considered to be the very first Cuban-born players, and they were signed by Griffith's uncle, then the manager of the Cincinnati Reds. So how much of an impact did Cambria and Griffith have? Well, before the 1930s, only about 19 Cubans had ever played in the majors. But between 1935 and 1956, 51 Cuban-born players made their way into the majors, and 32 of them came in with the Senators. That's about 63%. In 1944 alone, there were 9 Cuban players on the Senators roster, and more were on the way. So while the Washington Senators officially broke their color barrier in 1954 with Carlos Paula, team owner Clark Griffith had obviously employed Cuban players long before Jackie Robinson's 1947 Dodger debut. During the 1950s, it was common for there to be at least 5 Cuban-born players on the Senators in any given season. The Cuban players who arrived on U.S. shores during the 1950s produced not only the largest group to reach the majors, but perhaps the most talented, Sandy Consuegra among them. Okay, now let's talk about Joe Cambria. On the plus side, he's credited with signing as many as 400 Cubans for the Washington Senators, and that obviously greatly improved the integration of the game. On the other hand, Cambria definitely had his detractors. Basically, he was accused of getting a lot of signatures on contracts at rock-bottom prices, taking advantage of the situation that some of the players were in, and turning them over to the league. Now, because so many players signed, there was a massive influx of Cuban players who, just based on the odds, weren't going to make it to the big leagues. And so they would remain in the minors, and those players were definitely faced with unexpected adversities, being forced to play the game in areas of the U.S. where race and integration were definitely hotbed issues. However, many players would come to his defense, referring to him as Papa Joe, a father figure that helped them through a very formative period in their lives. In fact, most Cuban players seemed to enjoy life in Washington. Within walking distance from Griffith Stadium were some of the best jazz musicians and touring Cuban acts the 1950s had to offer. Spanish-speaking diplomats would often mix with the players in town, and there were plenty of families with Cuban ties to connect with on the road. But just as the major league influence and impact of Cuban players was gaining traction, in 1959, the Cuban Revolution, spearheaded by Fidel Castro, changed the trajectory of baseball in Cuba, and in effect, the United States as well. So now whenever I look at this Consuegra card, I'm going to be thinking about Papa Joe, Clark Griffith, the Washington Senators, and all these Cuban players that definitely changed the game. Thanks for checking out the video, guys. I'll see you on the next one.